They say some discoveries are made not out of curiosity, but out of obsession. And in the year 1902, deep in the cold corridors of a crumbling London hospital, a surgeon's obsession would lead to something so unholy it would haunt the medical world for decades. The newspapers called it the miracle of flesh, but those who truly knew what happened inside St. Maro's Hospital called it something else: the fourth hand. But before we continue this disturbing story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves hidden stories. It helps bring more of these untold truths to light. It began on a rain-slick night, when Dr. Elias Harrow, a man once celebrated for his pioneering work in reconstructive surgery, walked into the hospital morgue with a single candle and a box of surgical instruments. He was not scheduled to be there. The night porter swore he saw Harrow enter, but never saw him leave. And by dawn, the quiet halls of St. Maro's would never feel the same again. In those days, the world of medicine was changing faster than the world itself. London, 1902, a city choking on smoke and ambition. The industrial age had birthed miracles and monsters alike. Electricity buzzed through newly laid wires. Gas lights flickered against cobblestone alleys, and the scent of formaldehyde hung heavy in the air of every teaching hospital. The field of surgery, still young and brutal, was a battlefield of reputation, where a steady hand could make you a god, and a single mistake could turn you into a ghost of your own career. Dr. Elias Harrow was neither a god nor a ghost, not yet. But those who worked under him knew he was a man possessed. For the last 5 years he had dedicated himself to one impossible idea: the full transplantation of a human limb. At a time when anesthesia was crude and antisepsis barely understood, Harrow dreamt of taking the hand of the dead and giving it to the living, not as a crude attachment, but as a functioning, feeling part of the body. His colleagues mocked him. His students whispered that he'd gone mad. But Harrow didn't care, because in his small laboratory beneath St. Maro's, he believed he was closer than anyone else to touching God's forbidden design. And then came the accident. It was a fog-choked evening in January when the omnibus overturned near Whitechapel. Among the victims was a young pianist, Thomas Bellamy, 26, bright-eyed, full of life. His right hand, crushed beyond repair, had been his livelihood. Harrow had operated on him twice before, repairing the damage from a factory explosion years earlier. The man trusted him, even called him the doctor who gave me my music back. But when Bellamy was brought in this time, Harrow knew the truth: the hand was beyond saving. In another time, another world, that would have been the end of the story. But Elias Harrow didn't believe in endings. He began keeping the crushed hand preserved in a jar of carbolic solution. His assistants thought it was a macabre keepsake, a token of guilt. But to Harrow it was a challenge. He believed that life could be coaxed if only one knew how to whisper to it. He studied tissue decay, nerve regeneration, the obscure works of early German physiologists who spoke of transmissible vitality. At night, under gaslight, he would sit for hours staring at that jar, the pale fingers floating in amber liquid, imagining how they might move again. Then, one morning, a letter arrived from Vienna. It was from Professor Reinhard Vogel, a controversial anatomist who claimed to have achieved temporary tissue reanimation through a new electrical technique. Vogel invited Harrow to witness a demonstration. The two men met in February of 1902, and what Harrow saw there changed him forever. In the basement of a private clinic, Vogel placed a severed dog's leg upon a metal slab. He connected 2 thin copper rods to the limb and sent a series of electric pulses through the flesh. The result was horrifying. The paw twitched, flexed, and for a brief second, it curled as if trying to grasp something invisible. The movement lasted only a moment, but for Harrow it was proof. Proof that death was not an absolute, merely a condition that could be postponed. When he returned to London, he was no longer the same man. Over the following months, Elias Harrow disappeared from his usual lectures. His colleagues complained of strange smells from his laboratory: ozone, burning hair, and something worse. The nurses whispered that they saw shadows moving behind frosted glass, even when no one was inside. He dismissed most of his assistants, saying he required silence for progress, and soon he began spending nights in the morgue. It was there, among the cold marble slabs, that he met Margaret Vale. Margaret was a nurse at St. Maro's. one of the few who still showed Harrow kindness. She was 28, with the quiet patience of someone who had seen too much suffering to be easily shocked. Harrow trusted her, perhaps too much. He confided in her his dream, to restore Thomas Bellamy's ruined hand. She thought it was grief speaking, the ramblings of a man haunted by failure. Until one night, she followed him. Through a cracked door, she saw Harrow standing over two tables. On one lay the body of a freshly deceased convict, an unclaimed man from the gallows, still warm. On the other lay Bellamy, unconscious but alive, his right arm surgically opened. Between them, the pale preserved hand floated in a basin, glistening like wax. Wires snaked across the floor, connected to a crude galvanic machine, humming with electric light. Margaret watched in horror as Harrow began to work. Hours passed in the damp air of the morgue. He spoke softly to himself, repeating Latin phrases as if reciting scripture. He attached veins to veins, nerves to nerves, each suture trembling under his trembling fingers. The smell of antiseptic mixed with ozone. Then came the moment. He turned the machine's lever. The electric current crackled through the copper rods, lighting the walls in ghastly flashes. The hand, that dead floating hand, jerked. Once, twice. And then, the fingers curled. Margaret screamed. Harrow turned sharply, sweat pouring down his brow. "It's working," he whispered. "Do you see it, Margaret?" "It's feeling again." She fled before he could say more, running through the corridors until she collapsed near the chapel steps. By dawn, when she returned with others, Harrow's laboratory was empty. The convict's body was gone. Thomas Bellamy's bed was stripped. Only the smell of burning ozone lingered, and a single bloody handprint smeared across the metal table. For 3 days, no one saw Harrow. St. Marrow's shut down his laboratory and police began investigating. But on the fourth night, a carriage was found overturned near the Thames embankment. Inside lay Elias Harrow, unconscious, delirious, and clutching something beneath his coat. When the constables pried it loose, they found a human hand, attached crudely to his own arm, a second right hand, stitched to the wrist, grotesque and pale, yet warm to the touch. The newspapers ran wild. "Mad surgeon attaches extra limb," read the headlines. But Harrow was in no state to answer. He was taken to Bedlam Asylum, where doctors noted his feverish ravings about the fourth hand that moved on its own. They thought him insane. But the attendants at Bedlam began reporting strange things: the sound of tapping at night, the marks of fingernails on the inside of his cell door. When they opened it, Harrow was often asleep, but his extra hand was not. By mid-1902, the case of Dr. Elias Harrow became legend. Students whispered about him in anatomy halls. Newspapers sensationalized his second soul. But the real horror came later, from the people who had known him best. Margaret Vale was found dead in her lodgings, a victim of apparent strangulation, though no one could explain why the bruises on her neck were from two right hands. The hospital board tried to bury the story, calling it hysteria and journalistic fiction. St. Marrow's closed its basement wing entirely, sealing the old morgue. The city moved on, but not everyone forgot. In October, an anonymous letter reached the Lancet Medical Journal, claiming to be written by a nurse who had witnessed the true aftermath of Harrow's experiment. She wrote that when Harrow's body was finally exhumed for study, his right arm bore not two, but three distinct wrists beneath layers of scar tissue, as though new hands had begun to grow, one over another. The letter was dismissed as a hoax, but in the archives of the Royal College of Surgeons, there remains an entry, dated 1902, describing a specimen of unusual morphology, multiple carpal structures fused by hypertrophic regeneration. The record does not list the owner's name. For years afterward, doctors reported dreams of feeling phantom fingers brushing their cheeks as they slept, of scalpel handles that twitched under unseen pressure. At St. Marrow's, the sealed morgue was reopened in 1914 to serve as a temporary morgue for war casualties. The men who worked there said that sometimes, when the lamps flickered, they saw fingerprints appear in the condensation of the steel doors. Always the same pattern, always the same shape, always the right hand. They say Elias Harrow's work died with him, but then again, no one ever found the fourth hand. The story should have ended with the burial of Dr. Elias Harrow, a quiet grave beneath grey London soil, and a case best left to the dust of forgotten archives. But it didn't. Because death, as Harrow had once written, is a poor gatekeeper. In the years following his passing, the legend of the fourth hand grew like a shadow no one could quite dispel. The physicians of St. Maro's avoided speaking his name. The young nurses crossed themselves when passing the locked morgue door. But somewhere beneath the official silence, the story refused to die, whispered by orderlies, told in the flicker of gaslight, growing more twisted each time. And always, always, the same refrain, the hand still moves. In 1903, 1 year after the Harrow scandal, a man named Inspector Jonathan Graves was assigned to re-examine several unsolved hospital incidents tied to the surgeon's name. Graves was no stranger to strange cases, a war veteran turned investigator, known for his calm precision and skepticism. But even he admitted, in his later reports, that something about Harrow's file reeked of the unexplainable. The case began not with Harrow's death, but with the aftermath. During the post-mortem, 2 attending pathologists, Dr. Lionel Greaves and Arthur Dayton, had made detailed sketches of Harrow's arm. Both confirmed that there were abnormal subdermal joints, evidence of multiple limb grafts fused together. But the sketches were never published. A week later, Dr. Dayton fell ill with what the papers called a wasting fever. Within a fortnight, he was dead. Dr. Greaves vanished. His lodgings were found undisturbed except for a journal left open on the table. The last page contained only 2 words, scrawled in uneven ink. It moved. Inspector Graves began his investigation at Bedlam Asylum, where Harrow had spent his final weeks. The warden, an aging man with trembling hands, guided him through the crumbling corridors, warning that most records had been misplaced or destroyed. After the incident, the warden murmured, we sealed his cell. There was unpleasantness. Inside the cell, Graves found the walls scarred with scratches, hundreds of them, uneven, frantic, like the marks of a trapped animal. Each gouge measured about the width of a human finger, but what disturbed him most was the iron bed frame. The bars were bent, as though something or someone had tried to pull itself free using too many hands. Beneath the bed, hidden under a loose stone, Graves discovered a scrap of paper, a torn fragment from one of Harrow's surgical notes. It read, reattachment successful. Movement observed during sleep. Muscle tone independent of neural impulse. The hand knows. He pocketed the note and left without comment, but witnesses said his face had turned white as bone. The deeper Graves dug, the darker the trail became. Margaret Vale's death, officially ruled self-inflicted, now looked less certain. Her autopsy notes described strangulation by an anomalous dual grip, the bruises asymmetric and inconsistent with suicide. Graves followed rumors that Harrow had performed more than one transplant before his final breakdown, that he had been experimenting not only with limbs, but with grafted nerve clusters, attempting to make dead tissue remember its prior host. A former assistant of Harrow's, Samuel Fenwick, confirmed this in part. Fenwick met Graves in a pub off Fleet Street, speaking in a whisper as if afraid the walls might hear. Dr. Harrow believed every part of the body stores memory, Fenwick said. He called it residual consciousness. He thought if he could link the right pathways, he could make one man's flesh obey another's will. But toward the end, it wasn't the host commanding the grafts, it was the other way around. Graves asked what he meant. Fenwick stared at his shaking hands and replied softly, I mean the hands began to act, even when the patient was asleep. The more Graves uncovered, the more the city wanted him to stop. The Ministry of Health dismissed his findings as Gothic nonsense. The hospital board burned several of Harrow's notebooks, citing public panic. But Graves persisted, writing in his personal log that truth has never favored the comfortable. Then came the event that changed everything. In November 1903, St. Maro's reopened its basement to house overflow from a nearby infirmary. A new team of orderlies began cleaning the old surgical rooms. Among them was a young porter named Edward Calloway. On his third night shift, Edward failed to return from rounds. When his body was discovered the next morning, his face was pale, eyes open, mouth twisted in silent terror. The cause of death: heart failure. But what chilled Graves most were Edward's hands. Both of them were swollen, bruised, as though he had been fighting against something pulling at his wrists. And carved into the flesh of his right palm, in crude letters, were the words, "Helps us." Graves ordered the morgue unsealed and personally oversaw the inspection. The old galvanic machine was still there, covered in rust and dust, the copper wires tangled like vines. But there was something else, a faint rhythmic sound echoing from the back room. When the men followed it, they found a jar resting on a shelf, half filled with murky fluid. Inside, suspended like a relic, floated a severed human hand. It was pale, shriveled, but unmistakably intact, and the fingers were tapping, ever so lightly, against the glass. The jar was taken as evidence. Graves had it transferred to a secure vault in Scotland Yard's pathology department. Yet by morning it was gone. The clerk on duty claimed that a doctor from St. Maro's had arrived with official papers to collect it. No such doctor existed. After that night, Inspector Graves changed. He stopped attending church, stopped answering letters, grew withdrawn. His reports became erratic, filled with strange metaphors about the persistence of the body and the tyranny of touch. His colleagues thought the horrors of Bedlam had broken his mind. But the truth was darker, because Graves had begun experiencing something he couldn't explain. It started with an itch, a subtle crawling sensation under his skin, always near his right wrist. Then, as weeks passed, he found bruises appearing in the shape of finger marks, as though something, had been gripping him tightly in his sleep. He wrote in his diary, "It wishes to be whole again. It remembers." By February 1904, Graves vanished. His flat was found empty save for his coat, hat, and a small leather-bound notebook. The final entry read, "If I am gone, tell them it was Harrow's hand that found me." For years, the fourth hand case remained buried beneath layers of bureaucratic silence. But history has a way of resurfacing at inconvenient times. In 1921, during renovations of the old St. Maro's Hospital, by then renamed Southwark Medical Institute, workers uncovered a hidden storage vault sealed behind a false wall. Inside were dozens of glass jars containing surgical specimens, most labeled, some not. One jar, larger than the rest, held something shocking, an entire human forearm, perfectly preserved, the skin unusually fresh despite the passage of nearly 2 decades. The medical staff debated what to do. The war had hardened them to the grotesque, but this specimen felt wrong, too lifelike, as if it were merely sleeping. The chief surgeon, Dr. Leonard Pritchard, ordered it destroyed. But before that could happen, the arm mysteriously vanished overnight. The watchman swore he saw a figure leaving through the courtyard, a man carrying something wrapped in cloth that hung like a limb. He chased the figure, but when it turned toward him, the watchman collapsed from shock. He later told investigators it was not a man. It was a doctor, with too many hands. By the 1930s, the fourth hand had become London folklore. Children dared one another to sneak into the old hospital ruins and shake the doctor's hand. Newspapers occasionally published retrospectives calling Harrow a tragic visionary or a mad genius of surgery. Few believed the darker parts of the tale anymore. But then came the letter, the one that would reignite the story for good. In 1937, the editor of the Lancet Medical Journal received an unsigned envelope containing several aged photographs and a typed note. The photos showed what appeared to be a preserved arm, marked with crude sutures. The note read, "Harrow was right. The fourth hand survives. The flesh remembers. It seeks reunion." The letter was dismissed as a hoax. Yet within weeks, strange reports began surfacing again. Violinist performing at a Soho theater claimed her bow was snatched from her hand by something unseen. A mortician at St. Olave's reported that corpses in his care bore new scratches overnight. A sailor brought into the dock's infirmary swore that he saw a disembodied hand crawling through the fog, dragging its wrist like a wounded animal. And through it all, the rumors circled back to one place, the shuttered ruins of St. Maro's Hospital, where the story had first begun. In 1940, amid the chaos of the Blitz, St. Maro's took its final breath. A German bomb struck the old West Wing, reducing much of the structure to rubble. But among the debris, a firefighter named George Hollis made a curious discovery. While clearing the remains of the basement, he found a small metal box, blackened by smoke yet sealed tight. Inside was a folded page from a notebook, preserved miraculously from the flames. The handwriting matched samples of Dr. Elias Harrow. The note read, "If the fourth hand fails, the fifth shall awaken. I have seen it in dreams, the hand that touches without flesh." No one ever deciphered what it meant. Hollis kept the note as a morbid souvenir. Years later, he gave it to his grandson, who donated it to a private collector. But something strange followed that note wherever it went. The collector reported that objects in his study would shift during the night. Papers rearranged, pens rolling off the desk, candles snuffed out mid-burn. His maid quit after claiming she felt cold fingers trace across her neck while she slept. Decades passed. The world moved on. The ruins of St. Maro's were finally demolished in 1972, replaced by a block of council flats. The memory of Harrow faded into the city's folklore, a ghost story told by old nurses over tea. Until 2002, the centenary of his death. That year, a team of urban historians from King's College obtained permission to excavate the foundations of the former hospital. Among them was Dr. Abigail North, an expert in medical history, fascinated by forgotten surgeons of the 19th century. She led a small crew into the underground remains, documenting what little survived: rusted instruments, cracked jars, fragments of old medical ledgers. On the fourth day of the dig, one of her assistants, a student named Clara Ames, uncovered a strange iron box beneath the collapsed floor of the old morgue. It was sealed tight, the hinges fused with rust. They forced it open, expecting perhaps old surgical notes. Instead, inside was a glass jar, unbroken, half filled with cloudy formalin. Floating within it was a pale, human hand. The jar bore a faint inscription scratched into the glass: "Property of E. Harrow, 1902. When Dr. North thought she had found the relic of a legend, she took photographs, logged it, and sent the specimen to the pathology department for preservation. But over the following days, the excavation site was plagued by small, unnerving incidents. Equipment went missing. Lights flickered in the tunnels. One night, a guard quit after hearing knocking from inside the storage crate. When the crate was opened, nothing was found inside, except for condensation on the glass of the jar, shaped unmistakably like fingerprints. 2 weeks later, Dr. North suffered a severe accident. She was found unconscious at home, having fallen down her staircase. She survived, but her right arm was broken in several places. In her hospital statement, she claimed she had been pushed. When asked by whom, she hesitated, then whispered, "It was my own hand." The specimen disappeared from the pathology lab the same night, and that is where the official record ends. No one knows where the jar went, or if it still exists. Some say it was stolen by a collector. Others believe it was destroyed, but among historians, the fourth hand remains a haunting enigma. The blurred line between science and madness, life and afterlife. Because every few years, scattered reports emerge. A medical student in Vienna claiming to have found an unclassified specimen matching Harrow's description. A morgue attendant in Prague insisting a preserved hand in his care changed position overnight. Each time the story fades, but it always returns, carried like a whisper through generations of surgeons who still, late at night, feel the weight of invisible fingers pressing upon theirs. They say Elias Harrow wanted to give life where there was none, but perhaps what he gave was something that never truly dies. And so the legend endures, of the doctor who wouldn't stop at 3 hands, of the limb that learned to live on its own, of the experiment that should never have worked, but somehow did. They call it many names now: Harrow's curse, the phantom graft, the surgeon's shadow. But in the forgotten corners of London, where fog still crawls over the old cobblestones, those who remember still whisper its truest name: the fourth hand. It has been more than a century since Dr. Elias Harrow last walked the halls of St. Maro's Hospital. 100 years since the candlelight flickered over his surgical table, and a hand that should have remained dead twitched with impossible life. Time, they say, buries all sins. But some things refuse to stay buried. Some things wait. In 2022, the name Elias Harrow resurfaced, not in a history book, not in a medical journal, but on the cold, glowing screen of a laptop inside a small London flat. The laptop belonged to Daniel Mercer, a 34-year-old journalist working for an online publication specializing in lost history and unsolved archives. He had been assigned a small project, a feature on forgotten British surgeons who changed medicine. Daniel didn't know that this minor assignment would destroy his sleep for the next 2 years. It began, innocently enough, with a database search. Harrow's name appeared only once, in an obscure 1902 medical registry. The entry was brief. Dr. Elias Harrow, former lecturer, St. Maro's Hospital, license revoked, deceased. But attached to the file was a single scanned document added by an anonymous archivist in 1998. It contained 2 words typed neatly at the top: the fourth hand. At first, Daniel assumed it was a nickname, perhaps a forgotten medical joke. But the deeper he looked, the stranger it became. There were no published papers under Harrow's name, no references in medical journals, no obituary. It was as if the man had been erased from history, deliberately. Intrigued, Daniel reached out to the Royal College of Surgeons, hoping to find something more. An elderly archivist there, Mr. Pembroke, invited him to visit. When Daniel arrived, the old man seemed uneasy, his hands trembling as he produced a small, dust-covered file. "I shouldn't even be showing you this," he said, adjusting his spectacles. Most of Harrow's materials were confiscated, but this one slipped through. Inside the file was a yellowed letter written in thin, shaky ink. The handwriting matched samples from 1902. It was signed, Inspector Jonathan Graves. The hand persists. Its owner is long dead, yet it remains warm. I fear it dreams. Daniel stared at the line for minutes, unsure if he was reading the ravings of a lunatic or the beginning of something extraordinary. When he looked up, Pembroke was watching him closely. "You see," the archivist whispered, "the worst part isn't that it might be false, it's that it might not." Over the following weeks, Daniel's curiosity hardened into obsession. He began tracing every thread he could find: digitized asylum records, death certificates, even newspaper clippings from the 1900s. But the story came together like a nightmare in pieces: Harrow's failed experiments, his confinement at Bedlam, the sealed morgue, the missing specimen. Then, one evening, as Daniel scrolled through an online archive of forgotten London hospitals, he found an image that made his blood run cold. It was a black-and-white photograph dated 1902, a group portrait of St. Maro's staff. In the back row stood 6 surgeons in white coats. Their faces were solemn, eyes hollow from long hours and gaslight. But one man, standing slightly apart from the others, seemed different. His gaze burned directly into the camera. His right arm hung at an odd angle as though weighed down. And though the photo was faded, Daniel swore he could see an extra wrist just beneath the cuff of the man's sleeve. The nameplate at the bottom confirmed it: Dr. E. Harrow. Haunted by the image, Daniel couldn't sleep. He printed it, pinned it above his desk, and spent nights studying it under lamplight. The more he stared, the more details emerged: faint lines, blurred shapes that might have been reflections, or something behind him. At first, he thought it was paranoia. Then, strange things began happening in his flat. The lights flickered. His computer would power on by itself, the search bar filling with words he hadn't typed. Harrow alive. The fourth returns. It remembers. He brushed it off as a glitch, until the night he woke to find the photo lying face down on the floor. When he turned it over, there were smudges on the glass, the shape of fingertips. 4 of them. By now, Daniel was convinced he was chasing something far larger than a forgotten medical scandal. He reached out to a contact at King's College, a medical historian named Dr. Amelia North, granddaughter of the late Abigail North, the archaeologist who had rediscovered the Harrow specimen in 2002 before her mysterious accident. When Daniel mentioned the words, "the fourth hand," Amelia's expression changed. "You've heard of that?" she asked. Her voice trembled slightly. "My grandmother used to talk about it when I was a child, said she could still feel it, even after it was gone." Daniel blinked. Feel what? Amelia hesitated. Then she lifted her right sleeve. Across her wrist was a faint, spiral-shaped scar. She broke her arm in that fall, Amelia said quietly. But her bones healed in a way doctors couldn't explain. They said it looked as if something had started to form beneath the skin. Something not hers. The two decided to collaborate, Amelia with her academic credentials, Daniel with his journalistic reach. Together, they began reconstructing Harrow's final experiment. They discovered that before his breakdown, Harrow had ordered shipments of rare materials, zinc electrodes, surgical silk, and quantities of human nerve tissue sourced illegally from continental Europe. More disturbing were his private notes, fragments of which survived in the archives. If the soul does not reside in the heart nor the brain, then where? Perhaps it lingers in the smallest gestures, the flex of a knuckle, the curve of a palm. Perhaps the hand remembers what the mind forgets. Amelia translated these lines slowly, her voice shaking as she read. He thought touch could hold memory, she said. That by transplanting a hand, he could also transplant a fragment of the person, their will, their instinct. Daniel exhaled. And if that will refuse to die? Amelia looked up. Then the hand would keep living, even without him. Their research led them to Southwark, where the original foundations of St. Maro's still lay buried beneath a council housing complex. The caretaker, an old man named Mr. Callan, agreed to let them explore the basement tunnels that had survived beneath the structure. They descended with torches and recording equipment, the air thick with damp and decay. The tunnels stretched for hundreds of feet, remnants of the old hospital's service corridors. Along the walls, faded signs still read morgue and surgical storage. After an hour of searching, Amelia stopped. Her light had caught something, a door half collapsed under debris, its surface marked with a faint burned handprint. 4 fingers, no thumb. They cleared the rubble and forced it open. The air that poured out smelled of old iron and ether. Inside was a small room, blackened by time, shelves lined with rusted instruments, broken jars, and the remnants of an electrical device with copper coils still intact. And in the center, on a corroded table, lay a small wooden box. Daniel's hands trembled as he pried it open. Inside was a notebook, its pages damp but legible. The first page bore Harrow's handwriting. Experiment 13. Transfer incomplete. The fourth hand resists obedience. It acts with purpose. I have become its instrument. Beneath the entry, faint stains had bled into the paper, not ink, but something darker, long-dried. Amelia turned another page and froze. A sketch. It showed a human arm, but not normal, branching at the wrist, splitting into 2 sets of fingers, like a grotesque tree of flesh. Beneath it, Harrow had written, multiplication inevitable. Each graft seeks another. A sudden noise broke the silence. A faint tapping, rhythmic, coming from somewhere in the dark. They swung their torches around. Nothing. Then again. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from beneath the table. Daniel crouched and lifted the corner of the wooden platform. The sound stopped. He leaned closer and saw it. A small glass jar half buried in dust. Inside floated a pale, shriveled hand. The air seemed to vanish. For a moment, no one moved. Then, before either of them could speak, the jar's liquid began to ripple, softly at first, then violently, as if something were stirring within. The fingers twitched, once, twice, then pressed flat against the glass from the inside. Amelia screamed. The jar slipped from Daniel's grasp, shattering across the floor. The liquid hissed as it touched the ground. The hand, slick and trembling, fell free, its skin gray and veined. And then it moved. Not a spasm, not a twitch, a movement deliberate and slow. It flexed its fingers, curled them inward, and began to crawl, dragging its wrist stump across the floor like a spider of flesh. Daniel stumbled back, tripping over a beam. Amelia froze, her light shaking wildly. The hand stopped between them, fingers splayed. Then, almost tenderly, it reached forward and brushed Daniel's shoe. He kicked it away. It struck the wall and fell still, the room filled with their ragged breathing. "Get the box," Amelia gasped. "We have to—" But before she could finish, the light went out. Darkness swallowed them. The only sound was the drip of water and the faint, wet shuffle of something moving. Daniel groped for his phone, its screen flickering weakly. In that dim light he saw the impossible. The hand, no longer on the floor. It was climbing the wall, dragging itself upward by the nails, leaving streaks of dark residue behind. It reached the ceiling, paused, then dropped, straight onto Amelia. Her scream tore through the tunnel. She fell, thrashing, as the thing clung to her wrist, its fingers digging into her skin. Daniel lunged forward, grabbed a rusted metal rod, and struck it, once, twice, until it fell limp. Amelia sobbed, clutching her arm. The hand lay motionless beside her, its fingers curled like the petals of a dying flower. They fled, leaving everything behind. By the time they emerged into the night, both were trembling and half delirious. Daniel wanted to call the police, but Amelia stopped him. "Who would believe us?" she said. Her eyes were wild, her voice shaking. "You saw what it did. You saw it move." They made a pact to never speak of it again. But that night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt it, a phantom pressure on his right wrist, faint but undeniable, as though invisible fingers were tracing his veins. He told himself it was shock, trauma, until, 2 days later, he received a voicemail from Amelia. Her voice was trembling. "Daniel, it's spreading. The scar is growing. It itches all the time. I swear I can feel it moving under the skin. Please call me back," he called. No answer. When he went to her flat the next day, the door was unlocked. The apartment was empty. On the kitchen table lay her phone, recording. The screen showed a single video file. Daniel pressed play. The footage was shaky, filmed in low light. Amelia sat before the camera, pale, sweating, her right arm bandaged. She unwrapped it slowly. Beneath the gauze, her wrist was swollen, veins pulsing visibly beneath the surface. "It's inside," she whispered. "It doesn't want to die." She lifted her hand. The skin along her forearm rippled, like something shifting beneath it. And then, her fingers began to move. Not all at once, but in strange, independent rhythms, like each one obeyed a different command. Amelia's eyes filled with tears. "It's learning," she said. "It remembers him. It remembers everything." The video cut off abruptly. Daniel never found her. He quit his job, deleted his social media, and left London entirely. But his obsession followed him. In his isolation, he began seeing patterns. Photographs on old newspaper microfilm where the same blurred shape appeared near hospital ruins. Headlines mentioning unexplained break-ins at medical museums. And then came the final blow. A small parcel arrived at his rented cottage in Cornwall. No return address. Inside was a glass jar, half filled with clear fluid. Floating within, a human hand. Attached was a note typed on yellowed paper. "It's yours now. Keep it safe. A.N." Daniel dropped the jar immediately, smashing it across the floor. The liquid soaked into the wood. He ran from the room, heart pounding. When he returned minutes later, the hand was gone. Only faint, wet fingerprints led to the door. 4 of them. That was 6 months ago. No one has seen Daniel Mercer since. Neighbors reported that in his final weeks, he was seen pacing outside at night, muttering to himself, one arm wrapped in bandages. A local fisherman claimed he saw him standing on the cliffside before dawn, talking to someone unseen, his hand moving strangely, as if gesturing on its own. Police later found his cottage empty, except for one thing. On the wall above his desk, scrawled in what appeared to be dried blood, were 3 words, "It found me," and beneath them, a handprint. 4 fingers. No thumb. Some say the legend of the 4th hand is over. Others say it has only just begun. Because for every person who's touched that cursed relic, the story continues, not through words, but through flesh. And if you ever feel a sudden pressure on your wrist, cold and unseen, if you ever dream of fingers curling where none should be, remember this: it may not be your hand that's moving. The report arrived at St. Maro's on the morning of February 2nd, 1913. It came sealed in a brown envelope with no return address, the paper inside damp and faintly smelling of river water. Nurse Edith March opened it absent-mindedly over breakfast, expecting requisition forms. Instead, she found 3 pages of handwritten notes in spidery ink, the words uneven, as though the writer had trembled while writing. At the top of the first page, underlined twice, was a single sentence. The fourth hand still moves beneath the floor. The letter claimed to be written by William Keene, a maintenance worker once employed at St. Maro's. He described a hidden subcellar discovered during renovations of the West Wing. Down there, he said, the air was thick with formaldehyde, and in one of the old storage rooms lay a collection of sealed jars, organs, preserved limbs, and one object unlike the rest, a human hand, sewn at the wrist with golden surgical thread, suspended in a cloudy fluid that glowed faintly whenever lightning flashed through the cracks above. Keene wrote that when he tried to lift the jar, he felt it twitch. Convinced he was imagining it, he placed it back, but later that night he awoke to find the imprint of 5 damp fingers on his own throat. The next morning he quit without notice. The letter ended abruptly with a warning. Do not open the jar. It remembers. Edith March, like many young nurses, had grown up hearing the legend of Dr. Elias Harrow. Some said he was a pioneer misunderstood by his peers. Others swore he was a murderer who cut too close to the divine. To her, it had always sounded like a ghost story whispered in hospital corridors, until that letter arrived. The hospital's director, Sir Alistair Wynne, dismissed it immediately. Superstitious nonsense, he called it, tearing the envelope in half and ordering it burned. But the letter never reached the fire. Edith kept it, tucked inside her Bible, unable to shake the feeling that the handwriting looked eerily familiar. The looping H in hand, identical to the one she had seen years earlier in Harrow's surgical notes preserved in the archives. Winter that year was merciless. London streets lay buried under ice. The Thames froze thick enough for boys to skate upon. Within St. Maro's, heating pipes groaned and burst. Entire wards were evacuated to the upper floors. One evening, while assisting in the relocation of supplies from the abandoned West Wing, Edith found herself standing before a locked door, half hidden behind a curtain of dust-covered drapes. Its brass plate read, "Subcellar Access B." Her heart quickened. She remembered Keene's words. When she tugged the handle, it resisted, until the old lock gave way with a sigh, exhaling a breath of cold air that smelled of damp stone and decay. Lantern in hand, she descended. The steps spiraled down into blackness, past rusted pipes and ancient signage, until she reached a low corridor lined with iron doors. Water dripped from the ceiling in rhythmic taps, like the beating of a slow, patient heart. At the corridor's end stood a door newer than the rest, its hinges polished, its keyhole plugged with wax. Someone not long ago had sealed it. Edith hesitated only a moment before scraping away the wax with her scalpel. The door opened onto a room barely larger than a coffin. Inside were shelves of preserved specimens, hearts, lungs, eyes staring blindly through the glass. And there, on the central table, sat a jar no larger than a man's head. The liquid inside shimmered faintly in the lantern light. Suspended within was a right hand, fingers elongated and stitched at the base with gold thread, exactly as the letter had described. What startled her most was not its condition, astonishingly intact after a decade, but its position. The fingers were pressed against the glass as though trying to push outward. For a long time she simply watched. Then, perhaps from fatigue or morbid curiosity, she whispered, "Dr. Harrow?" The liquid quivered. She froze. Another tremor rippled through the jar, delicate at first, then stronger, until one finger twitched, tapping twice against the glass. Edith stumbled back, her lantern nearly falling. The tapping continued, rhythmic, insistent, as though answering some unheard pulse. She fled up the stairs, slamming the door behind her. That night she dreamed of hands, thousands of them, reaching through the fog, each one pale and marked with tiny stitches of gold. When she awoke, her own right hand throbbed with pain. Under the skin at her wrist, a faint line of redness had appeared, like the beginning of an incision. She bandaged it and said nothing. But the next night the pain returned, sharper. She felt the phantom sensation of fingers not her own brushing her throat while she slept. By the third day, she went to Sir Wynn and demanded that the West Wing be sealed again. He laughed in her face. "We are a hospital, Nurse March, not a church for exorcism. Perhaps fewer ghost stories and more rest." That evening, he was found dead in his office, strangled. The medical report noted an impossible detail. The bruises around his neck showed 2 right hands. The inquest that followed was discreet. St. Marrow's, desperate to avoid scandal, listed the death as heart failure. Edith was ordered not to speak of what she had seen, but silence became impossible when more incidents began. Patients awakening with hand-shaped bruises on their arms, instruments moving on their own in the operating theater, and the faint echo of tapping from beneath the floors at night. The senior surgeon, Dr. Linton Gray, dismissed it as mass hysteria until he witnessed it himself. During an amputation, the severed limb, moments after removal, clenched into a fist. The patient died of shock. Linton left London the next morning and never practiced again. Edith, meanwhile, grew weaker. The redness at her wrist deepened into a pattern, 5 small crescents, exactly where fingernails might have pressed. She knew then that the thing in the jar was not merely flesh. It was awake, and it had chosen her. In March of 1913, a fire broke out in the West Wing. Witnesses claimed to see light flickering from the cellar moments before the flames erupted. Edith was last seen running toward the blaze, clutching something wrapped in cloth. The fire consumed most of the building. When the embers cooled, investigators found no trace of her body, only the cracked remains of a glass jar, its contents gone. For decades, no one spoke of her again. St. Marrow's was rebuilt, renamed, and modernized. The old records were sealed. The legend of the fourth hand faded into medical folklore until 1967. That year, during the hospital's renovation into a modern research center, construction workers uncovered a sealed lead box behind the foundation stones of the new pathology wing. Inside were several water-stained documents and a small bundle wrapped in linen. The papers were labeled Specimen Number 4, property of Dr. E. Harrow. The bundle contained a hand, perfectly preserved despite 6 decades underground. Scientists assumed it to be an early anatomical sample preserved with mercury salts, but when the lead casing was removed for examination, technicians reported a faint electrical charge emanating from the tissue. One even claimed he saw the thumb twitch. The sample was quietly transferred to the Royal College of Surgeons for study, and within days, their laboratory's electricity failed mysteriously for 3 nights in a row. An internal memo, later leaked, warned staff not to handle the specimen barehanded. The note ended with the phrase, "Possible contamination, unknown regenerative property. Proceed with isolation." No one did. By the 1980s, only fragments of the story remained. A handful of journalists attempted to investigate, linking the specimen to the legendary fourth hand, but the archives had conveniently lost all related documents. One reporter, Michael Turner, claimed he'd obtained a photograph of the hand taken in 1967, though when he developed the negatives, every frame was overexposed except for one, a blurred image of a hospital corridor and faintly visible on the wall, a handprint of blood, larger than any human's, with the thumb mirrored inward, as if belonging to the right hand of someone facing the opposite direction. Turner vanished 2 weeks later. His camera was found floating in the Thames. Now, more than a century after Harrow's first experiment, the name St. Marrow's has been forgotten, the building demolished. In its place stands a modern glass complex, the Harrow Institute of Regenerative Medicine, named ironically after the very man whose work was once condemned. Few within its walls know the true origin of its name. But some of the older night shift staff still whisper that in the lower maintenance tunnels, built directly over the old foundations, there is a section where the lights never stay on. Tools vanish, doors close by themselves, and sometimes, when the power flickers, the security cameras capture a brief, inexplicable image, the outline of a hand pressing from the inside of the lens, smearing the view with something that looks like blood. They call it a glitch. They call it superstition. But the engineers who have seen it refuse to work that shift again. Every generation since 1902 has found a new way to tell the same story, of a surgeon who refused to accept death, of a hand that would not rot, and of the quiet hum of electricity that pulses through every operating room today, like the heartbeat of something that learned, long ago, how to keep moving after it should have stopped. Somewhere, sealed behind concrete and wire, there may still be one preserved jar, the original. The fluid within no longer clear but dark, alive with slow movement. Perhaps it is only a myth. Perhaps. But on quiet nights, when the city sleeps and the machines rest, the doctors on call at the Harrow Institute sometimes hear a faint tapping from beneath the floor. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. Like a patient knocking gently to remind them he's still waiting for his operation to finish. And if they listen closely, they swear they can almost hear the faint whisper of a man's voice in the hum of the machines. It feels again. For more than a century, Dr. Elias Harrow's name had been spoken only in whispers, a cautionary tale told in anatomy halls and night shift cafeterias, the story of the man who tried to master life and ended up enslaved by it. But time, as it always does, has a way of sanding down horrors into curiosities. By the dawn of the 21st century, Harrow was no longer a warning. He was a mystery waiting to be rediscovered. And rediscovered he was. In 2003, during the digitization of old medical records, a technician at the Royal College of Surgeons came across a sealed envelope labeled EH, Restricted Archive. Inside was a series of photographs, grainy, sepia-toned images showing what appeared to be surgical notes, nerve diagrams, and one photograph that made her blood run cold. A human arm, opened from elbow to wrist, displaying 2 sets of veins branching into 3 distinct wrists. Attached to the photograph was a handwritten note. The 4th is forming. Do not interrupt the process. The technician, assuming it to be a hoax, forwarded the file to her supervisor. Within hours, the entire directory vanished from the system. When she checked her workstation the next morning, the monitor flickered once, then went dark, and on the glass screen was a faint smear of fingerprints. 5 of them, all from the right hand. The story might have ended there, lost again to bureaucracy and dust, if not for Dr. Clara Hensley, a biomedical researcher working at the newly established Harrow Institute of Regenerative Medicine. Hensley was known for her work in cellular reconstruction, regrowing tissue using electric stimulation. What she didn't know was that her laboratory occupied the exact site of Harrow's demolished hospital. When she first heard the local legends from maintenance staff, she laughed. But the more she read, the more she began to wonder. In one of the Institute's forgotten storage rooms, she found a metal cabinet still bearing the embossed initials EH. Inside were brittle folders containing incomplete research papers, and tucked within them, a small glass vial filled with a yellowing preservative fluid. At the bottom floated a single stitch of golden thread. Something about it felt alive. She placed it under a microscope, and what she saw defied biology. The thread, gold by color but fibrous in structure, pulsed faintly, as if it contained microscopic electrical activity. She measured it again and again, but the readings refused to settle. The more she observed it, the more she felt as if the pulse was synchronizing with her own heartbeat. She told no one. Weeks passed. Hensley's experiments began to accelerate. She combined the thread with modern stem cell samples, documenting faint but undeniable regenerative response. The tissue began knitting itself, without nutrient solution, without stimulation, as though remembering the shape it had once been. Then, one night in February 2004, the power failed. The backup generators kicked in, flooding the lab in red light. On the monitor, Hensley saw something moving in the petri dish. The tissue, once flat and formless, had begun to shape itself into what looked like the outline of a palm. She stepped closer. Her breath fogged the glass. The fingers flexed. The sound that followed was so soft she almost thought she imagined it. A faint, wet tapping from inside the containment glass. Once, twice, then 3 slow taps, echoing the rhythm first reported in St. Maro's Hospital a century before. Hensley froze. For a moment she considered pulling the plug, burning everything. But then curiosity, that same spark that once burned in Elias Harrow, won over fear. She whispered, barely audible, "Can you hear me?" The tissue quivered. 3 days later, Hensley was found collapsed in her lab, unresponsive. The security footage showed her working late, then standing motionless before the containment unit. At 2:47 a.m., she raised her right hand toward the glass, and the thing inside raised its own in perfect synchrony. Then the lights cut out. When the feed returned minutes later, she was gone. Her workstation was found intact, the experiment sealed, the container empty. But on the glass of the observation window, pressed faintly into condensation, was a perfect handprint, small, delicate, unmistakably hers, layered over another print beneath it. A man's, larger, older. The investigation concluded she had suffered an electrical accident and wandered off disoriented. Her body was never recovered. In the months that followed, the Institute shut down the entire lower level of the building, citing structural repairs. Employees whispered of strange noises in the vents, tapping, sometimes scratching. Tools went missing, doors locked themselves. Then, during a scheduled inspection, a maintenance worker discovered something behind the main generator panels, a narrow, bricked-up cavity no one had known existed. Inside, in the half-light of his torch, he saw 4 plaster casts mounted on a wooden beam, each one a human hand. 3 were cracked and old. The 4th was new. And beneath it, carved into the plaster, the words, "Property of E. Harrow, 1902, forever." When news of the discovery reached the surface, the directors of the Institute ordered it destroyed immediately, but before it could be removed, the power cut again, a total blackout lasting 17 minutes. When the lights returned, the cavity was empty. All that remained was a single trail of wet prints leading toward the elevator shaft. The fingerprints, when analyzed, did not match any living person. But their pattern was unique, identical to those recorded from Elias Harrow during his confinement in Bedlam Asylum in 1902. There are still those today who claim the legend is nothing more than elaborate fiction, a century-old myth dressed in scientific language. They say the human body cannot live beyond death, that nerves do not remember, that no limb can truly act on its own. But the nurses who work the night shift at Harrow Institute tell a different story. They speak of feeling the cold touch of fingers when they reach for instruments in the dark. They speak of doors opening by themselves when no one is near. And they speak of the lab's old intercom system, long disconnected, crackling to life at exactly 2:47 a.m. every February 2nd, whispering a single phrase through static, "It feels again." In 2020, the City of London approved a redevelopment plan for the entire Harrow district. As demolition crews prepared to remove the final sections of the old foundations, one of the workers, a man named David Quinn, found a rusted box beneath the earth. Thinking it a curiosity, he pried it open. Inside was a folded piece of paper and something wrapped in linen. The note read, "To whoever finds this, know that the line between death and invention is thinner than flesh. What we give to life does not always return what we expect. The hand that saves can also take." The 4th was never mine to claim. Signed, Elias Harrow, 1902. Quinn unwrapped the linen and saw it, the hand, mummified yet intact, the golden thread glinting through its seams. He dropped it and ran. When he came back with others, the box was empty. The ground where it had been disturbed looked as though something had crawled out, dragging itself toward the shadows of the half-demolished corridor. That night, every motion sensor in the site recorded movement in the same direction, slow, deliberate, almost human. Perhaps the strangest detail of all came from the security footage reviewed later. At 3:15 a.m., one of the cameras, the one facing the empty corridor, captured a figure walking slowly past. The footage was too grainy to identify the face, but the posture, the coat, the limp, they resembled an older man, stooped and thin, with one arm tucked beneath his cloak. And as he passed beneath the flickering light, his shadow stretched long across the wall, revealing not 2, but 4 hands. The screen went black. More than a century after Harrow's first experiment, the medical world stands on the brink of miracles he could only dream of: cloned tissue, nerve regeneration, synthetic organs. But somewhere in the cold hum of the laboratories, in the pulse of every electrical current that mimics life, there remains a trace of that forbidden origin, the experiment that began it all. Because the truth no one dares to admit is this: Every time we make the dead live again, we are speaking his language. And perhaps that is why in hospitals around the world, when the power flickers and the monitors glitch for a heartbeat, there are doctors who swear they see the faint outline of a hand pressing against the inside of the glass, tapping, gently, patiently, as if waiting to be remembered. They call it interference. They call it static. But some of them just whisper his name. Dr. Elias Harrow. The man who gave life a fourth hand and never learned how to let go. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out.